Empire of Blood. Death by starvation is the worst death of all. Eurylochus and the slaughter of the sun's cattle. A cow screams. Not the sound a cow is supposed to make, not a low, tired bellow into the wind. This is something else. A sound that catches in the throat and comes out wrong, comes out almost like a word. The blade is already in. Around the fire, 20 men stand over the carcass with their hands red to the wrist, and none of them will look at each other. The smoke from the fat is rising into a sky that has not changed in 6 weeks. The same wind, the same gray horizon, the same island they cannot leave. Remember that detail. 6 weeks. 6 weeks trapped on a strip of rock called Thrinacia, sacred pasture of the sun god Helios, while a wind that should have died in 3 days keeps blowing dead against them day after day, as if something wants them to stay exactly where they are. It isn't much of an island to be trapped on. That's the cruelty of it. No forest to hunt in for anything larger than what they've already snared. No town, no shrine, no friendly face who might trade grain for whatever cargo still sits in the ship's hold. Just open pasture, green and gently sloping down to the water, cropped short by the very cattle they've been forbidden to touch, under a sky that stays, with almost mocking consistency, perfectly clear. No storms to blame, no obvious danger to point to and say, "Here, this is why we can't leave." Just wind, just hunger, just weeks stacking on weeks with nothing visibly wrong except the growing hollowness in every man's stomach, and the increasingly obvious fact that whatever force is keeping that wind blowing the wrong direction does not appear to be in any hurry at all. The ship is beached. The stores are gone. What little grain they'd carried from the last port turned to paste and then to nothing, eaten raw, eaten desperate, weeks ago. The fish have stopped biting in the shallows they've picked clean. Men who once rowed for 18 hours without complaint now lie on the sand in the middle of the day, not sleeping, just conserving whatever they have left to conserve. There is only one source of meat on this island: golden cattle, moving slow and fat across the green, belonging to a god who can see everything they do because the sun sees everything. They have been told, twice, not to touch them. Told by the blind prophet Tiresias, down in the underworld, in words specific enough that there was no room to misunderstand. Leave the cattle of the sun alone and you go home. Touch them and you lose the ship, you lose the men, and you arrive on your own doorstep. If you arrive at all, as a beggar, alone, everyone you love already gone. Told a second time by the witch queen Circe, who has no reason to lie to them and every reason not to. Their captain has heard both warnings directly. He has made the men swear an oath, a real oath, sworn on the immortal gods, not to kill so much as one animal. And right now, at the exact moment his men are butchering the sun god's cattle on an open beach with the smoke rising straight up into a clear sky where anything could be watching, their captain is 300 yards away with his back to the whole scene, alone, praying. His name is Odysseus. You may know him. This is not really his story. This is the story of the man who did it while his back was turned. His name is Eurylochus, and 40 minutes ago he was not a mutineer. He was second in command. A cousin of the captain's wife, by some accounts, close enough to the family that when Odysseus needed someone to lead a scouting party into unknown territory, Eurylochus was the name he called. A trusted man. A careful man, if anything, the kind of man who, on this very voyage, had once refused to walk into a witch's house because something about it smelled wrong, and had been right. That man is standing over a dead cow with divine blood, or something like it, on his hands. Here's what happened in the hour before the knife came out. The men had gathered, the way starving men gather, in a loose ring with nobody quite looking at anybody else, because eye contact means somebody has to say the thing out loud first. And Eurylochus said it. He didn't scream it, that's important. He reasoned it. He told them, Every death that comes for a man is hateful, every single one. But to die of hunger, to feel your own body consume itself, slowly, with the food standing right there in front of you the entire time, that is the worst death there is. Worse than a quick blade, worse maybe than a god's lightning. So here is the offer, he told them. We kill the best of these cattle. We sacrifice them properly, the right words, the right fire, exactly as you'd honor any god. And when we get home, if we get home, we build Helios a temple, rich offerings. Whatever it takes to make it right later, once we're not starving to death on his beach. And if the god is still angry, if he wants to sink our ship over it, well, better a quick death by shipwreck, gulping seawater once and being done with it, than wasting away for weeks on this rock, watching each other die by inches. Think about the shape of that argument for a second. It isn't madness. It isn't a man foaming at the mouth. It's a cost-benefit calculation delivered calmly, by someone the crew trusted, and it's built entirely on a premise that sounds reasonable, and is completely, fatally wrong. That this is a choice between two kinds of death, when it is actually a choice between a slow death that might be survived and a fast one that will not be. The men didn't hesitate long. Starving men rarely do, once someone hands them a reason. They chose the fattest cattle from the herd. They plucked the tender leaves from a nearby oak because they had no barley left for the ritual, no white grain to scatter the way the old rites demanded. And that missing detail, the wrong leaf standing in for the right grain, is its own small omen, if you're the kind of listener who watches for those. They said the words. They poured what wine they had, and they killed. This is where it stops being a decision and starts being a scene. So picture it exactly as it happened. The hides they flayed off did not lie still. Ancient tradition says they began to crawl across the sand on their own, animal skins twitching, like something underneath them was still alive and trying to get up. The meat on the spits, both the raw flesh waiting to be cooked and the meat already roasting over the fire, began to low, to moo. A sound coming out of dead flesh that had no business making any sound at all. Nobody in the ancient audience for this story needed it explained to them. Everyone listening around that hearth thousands of years ago knew exactly what a moaning carcass meant. It meant the god had already seen. It meant the punishment clock had already started, before the meal was even finished cooking. Watch it happen in your mind for a second, slowed all the way down. A man crouched over a hide he has just stripped from the carcass, wiping his blade clean on his thigh, and the hide beneath his hand twitches. Not the residual muscle spasm of any freshly killed animal, which every one of these men has seen 100 times and knows the shape of, but something with rhythm to it, something that keeps going a beat too long. Somewhere behind him, over the fire, a spit of meat that has been turning for 20 minutes makes a sound low in its throat, and the man turning it freezes with his hand still on the wood and doesn't say anything, because saying it out loud makes it real in a way that silence still, for one more second, does not. Nobody stops eating. That's the detail worth sitting with longer than the omen itself. Not that the sign appeared. Ancient audiences expected signs, lived inside a world thick with them, but that 20 men, having just received unambiguous proof that a god already knows exactly what they've done, chose the fire over the warning anyway. Say it plainly. They had 6 weeks of starvation behind them, and as far as any of them could tell in that moment, they might have 6 more ahead. A groaning piece of meat is an abstraction. An empty stomach is not. The men ate anyway. For 6 straight days, they feasted. Actual feasted. The best food they'd had in a month, richer than anything they could have imagined during the worst of the starvation, while the wrongness of it sat over the whole camp like weather. And somewhere out on that beach, praying to gods who were not answering, was a captain who was about to come back from his walk and find out that his crew, his second in command, had just spent the family's entire remaining luck on a plate of stolen beef. Zeus was already listening. The god of storms and oaths and the punishment of exactly this kind of transgression doesn't need to be summoned. He was already watching a beach full of desperate men eat a sun god's cattle in the open air, under a cloudless sky, in full view of the one deity in the entire cosmos who cannot look away from anything ever, because looking is what he is. 7 days later they would leave this island. The wind would finally turn, too conveniently too late. And 19 of these 20 men would never see land again. This is a story about how that happens, not through a villain twirling a knife, cackling at the sky, daring the gods to strike him down, through something much more ordinary and much more frightening. A reasonable man in an unreasonable situation, making an argument that everyone around him desperately wanted to be true. We're going back 6 weeks now, and further than that, back to the beginning of this entire miserable decade of a voyage, to figure out who this man Eurylochus actually was before the hunger got to him. Because before he was the man who doomed a crew, he was something else entirely. He was the man who was right the last time it mattered, and nobody thanked him for it. There is no throne room in this story, no senate, no palace guard, no bureaucracy of scribes counting grain in some administrative capital. If you're used to this show tracing the machinery of empire through emperors and ministries and standing armies, set that machinery aside for an hour. Because the empire at the center of this episode is a stranger, more fragile thing entirely. It is a world held together by nothing but reputation, oath, and fear of the gods. And it is coming apart. Picture Greece, or rather the patchwork of kingdoms and city-states we'd later come to call Greece, somewhere in the murky centuries after the fall of Troy, in the period ancient audiences imagined as the end of the age of heroes. There is no Greece yet, in any political sense. There is no unified law, no shared currency, no single language of command. There are kings, dozens of them, ruling islands the size of a modern county, coastal towns, valley kingdoms hemmed in by mountains that make travel between them slower and more dangerous than a sea crossing. These kings do not rule because a constitution says they may. They rule because they can fight, because their fathers fought, because they command the loyalty of men who have chosen, this is the operative word, to follow them into war and share in whatever glory or plunder comes back. This is what scholars of the period call a heroic society, and the phrase is doing real work. Authority here is charismatic, not institutional. There is no police force enforcing a king's word after he's out of earshot. There is no tax office, no standing bureaucracy that persists whether the king is popular or not. What holds this entire fragile structure together is a web of personal loyalty, oath, and the threat, the very real threat, of divine punishment for anyone who breaks their word. You swear an oath in this world. You are not signing a contract that a court will enforce. You are inviting a god to watch you and to destroy you personally if you fail to keep it. That is the entire enforcement mechanism. Zeus specifically carries the title Zeus Horkios, Zeus of oaths, because oath-keeping is considered so fundamental to holding any society like this together that it needs its own dedicated deity watching over it like a hawk. There's a second pillar holding this whole fragile world together, and it matters just as much as the oath. Xenia, the guest-host relationship, the sacred obligation to shelter and feed a stranger who arrives at your door, no questions asked, because that stranger might be a god in disguise testing you, or might simply be a man who will someday be in a position to shelter you in turn. Zeus himself holds the title Xenios, Zeus of strangers and guests, specifically because this reciprocal duty of hospitality is treated as no less sacred than the oath itself. You will see this obligation violated, catastrophically, on both ends of this exact voyage. The Cyclops Polyphemus, refusing hospitality to Odysseus's men and eating them instead, and, waiting back home in Ithaca for Odysseus's eventual return, over 100 suitors abusing his own household's hospitality for years, eating his stores, courting his wife, treating his absence as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. This entire story cycle, in other words, is obsessively concerned with what happens when the informal, honor-based rules holding this fragmented world together get broken by people who calculate correctly that nobody is going to stop them in the moment. Thrinacia is simply the same violation turned inward. Not a stranger abusing a host's hospitality, but a crew abusing a god's. Now take that fragile system and put it under 10 years of the worst stress imaginable. The Trojan War, the 10-year siege that opens this entire cycle of stories, was not, in the world these stories imagine, a war fought by professional armies rotated home on schedule with pensions waiting. It was a war fought by kings and their personal retinues. Men who left their farms, their wives, their half-grown sons, and did not go home. Not once. Not for a decade. Every single year that war ground on, back home the vacuum grew larger. Wives aging alone, sons growing into men their fathers wouldn't recognize, rival claimants circling kingdoms whose rightful rulers hadn't set foot on their own soil in years. And that's before a single ship turns for home. Because when Troy finally falls, when the wooden horse trick works and the city burns, the war doesn't actually end for these men. It just becomes something worse. An odyssey. A word that didn't even exist as a concept before this specific catastrophe of a return journey gave English one. Storms scatter the returning fleets. Kings who fought side by side for a decade turn on each other in the chaos of the withdrawal. Some die crossing straits that should have taken days. Some are murdered in their own homes the moment they finally arrive, their thrones already stolen out from under them. This period even gets its own name in later tradition, the Nostoi, the returns, and it is, almost without exception, a catalogue of disaster. Coming home turns out to be more dangerous than the siege itself. Look at what happens to the other kings who sailed out of Troy roughly alongside Odysseus, because the pattern isn't incidental. It's the whole point of using the word nostoi at all. Agamemnon, the supreme commander of the entire Greek expedition, the most powerful king in this story, makes it home faster and more directly than almost anyone else, and is murdered in his own bathtub within hours of arriving, cut down by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover, who have spent the entire decade of his absence consolidating power and plotting exactly this. 10 years of siege warfare survived. An afternoon at home, fatal. Ajax the Lesser, a different Ajax from the more famous hero of that name, survives the sack of Troy itself, only to be drowned on the voyage home by Poseidon, punished for a specific act of arrogance, boasting after surviving a shipwreck by clinging to a rock that he would live in spite of the god's will. Poseidon splits the rock beneath him with his trident the instant the words leave his mouth. Menelaus, Agamemnon's own brother, the king whose wife's abduction started this entire war in the first place, doesn't reach home for 8 years after Troy falls, blown wildly off course through Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean in a wandering ordeal that runs almost as long as Odysseus's own, before finally making it back to a stable throne. Notice what these 3 outcomes have in common, because it's the exact structural point this episode has been building toward. None of these men lose their kingdoms or their lives to an enemy army. The war itself, 10 brutal years of it, is already over. What kills them, delays them, or nearly destroys them afterward is entirely different. Domestic betrayal, divine punishment for personal arrogance, and simple, prolonged bad luck with wind and current. The threat that actually threatens these heroic kings, in other words, was never really the Trojans. It was the return itself, The specific structural vulnerability of a world with no reliable infrastructure for getting a fleet of exhausted, plunder-laden ships back across open water, and no reliable authority left standing back home to make sure the throne is still there waiting when they finally arrive. Ancient audiences, hearing the opening lines of this particular story, would have already known most of these other outcomes. Agamemnon's murder especially was one of the most famous stories in the entire tradition, dramatized on stage repeatedly. They would have understood immediately, from the very framing of the tale, that a nostos, a homecoming, was never a formality in this world. It was its own separate ordeal, arguably more dangerous than the war that preceded it. Add one more structural piece to this picture because it's easy to miss, and it's doing enormous work underneath everything else. There is no logistics chain behind this fleet. No supply depots. No allied ports guaranteed to resupply a passing fleet with grain on credit. No Navy quartermaster keeping records of what's owed and what's been paid. Whatever food a ship carries when it leaves a friendly shore is, functionally, all the food that ship has, until it either makes landfall somewhere hospitable or someone aboard manages to hunt, fish, or trade for more. There is no version of radioing ahead for resupply, no safety net built into this world's infrastructure at all. When the god Aeolus gives Odysseus a bag of favorable winds later in this voyage, he also restocks his ship's food and offers hospitality freely, because that's simply what a functioning nostos depends on. A chain of individual personal acts of generosity from island to island, kingdom to kingdom, each one entirely optional, each one capable of simply not happening. Land somewhere hostile, or somewhere with nothing to spare, or somewhere sacred, where taking anything at all is forbidden, and the entire fragile system that's supposed to get you home breaks down instantly. Thrinacia is exactly that breakdown, in its purest form. An island with abundant food, directly in front of a starving crew, and a divine rule making every bit of it untouchable. Odysseus' homeward journey is simply the longest and strangest version of this same catastrophe. 10 years at Troy, and then, depending on how you count it, another decade trying to sail roughly 600 miles home. 600 miles. A trip that, under ordinary conditions, should take a matter of weeks. Why does it take 10 years instead? Because the ordinary conditions have collapsed entirely, and this is the structural detail worth sitting with before we go any further. In this world, geography itself is not neutral. The sea is not simply water and wind and current. It is patrolled, actively, personally, by gods who take offense, who hold grudges, who redirect entire fleets out of pure spite. Poseidon, god of the sea, will spend this entire voyage punishing Odysseus for blinding his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. A grudge so severe it turns a 600-mile trip into a decade-long ordeal, scattering the fleet across a map of monsters and witches and man-eating giants that exists, in the logic of this story, specifically because the sea god wants Odysseus to suffer as long and as thoroughly as possible before he's allowed to see his home again. This is worth pausing on, because it is the deep structural engine of the entire tragedy that's about to unfold. In the world of the Odyssey, the gods are not distant abstractions. They are functionally political actors with personal grudges and personal favorites, actively intervening in the fates of specific men for reasons that have nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with pride, offense, and family loyalty. Athena favors Odysseus and manipulates events to protect him. Poseidon despises him and manipulates events to destroy him. Helios, god of the sun, is about to become a third player in this tug-of-war, and unlike Athena, he has no particular fondness for anyone on this ship at all. And here's the detail that ought to unsettle you a little, if you're inclined to think of divine favor as something earned rather than simply granted. Nothing about Odysseus's own conduct across this voyage makes him obviously more deserving of Athena's protection than any of the men serving under him. He isn't more pious. He isn't more restrained. If anything, his habit of taunting defeated enemies, most notably shouting his own name back at the blinded Cyclops Polyphemus purely for the glory of it, directly triggers the curse from Poseidon that turns this entire voyage into a decade-long catastrophe in the first place. Athena favors him because she favors cunning, because something in his particular character appeals to her particular domain, not because he has passed some test of virtue the rest of his crew failed. Which means the entire outcome of this voyage, who lives, who dies, whose gamble gets rewarded and whose gets punished, was never actually a referendum on anyone's moral worth. It was a referendum on whose name a specific temperamental goddess happened to like. Disobeying a divine warning in this universe is not an abstract moral failing, the kind of thing that might catch up with you eventually, in some vague, cosmic sense, if there's a reckoning after all. It is an immediate, physical, structural risk, as real and as certain as gravity. Tiresias didn't warn Odysseus about the cattle of the sun as a metaphor for restraint. He warned him because touching those cattle triggers an actual mechanical, guaranteed consequence in the logic of this cosmos. The god sees. The god complains to Zeus, and Zeus, obligated by his own role as guarantor of divine and oath-bound order, acts. So here is the empire this episode is actually about, not a nation, not a bureaucracy, but a chain of command stretched to its absolute breaking point, floating on an ocean patrolled by petty, watchful gods, crewed by men who have already spent a decade at war and have now spent additional years watching their crewmates die one grotesque death at a time. Let's look at the actual structure of command aboard these ships because it matters enormously for what's about to happen on that beach. At the top, Odysseus, supreme commander by right of kingship, but also, and this is the detail that separates him from every other returning king in this cycle of stories, specifically favored by Athena, goddess of strategy and cunning, who intervenes on his behalf again and again throughout the journey. He is, by every account the tradition gives us, the single smartest man in this entire story cycle, the man who thought of the wooden horse, the man who talks his way past monsters that would kill anyone else on sight. But smart is not the same as present, and that gap, the gap between Odysseus's judgment and his physical presence, is where this entire tragedy is going to live. Because a fleet this large on a voyage this long cannot be commanded every single hour by one man. Odysseus needs subordinates. He needs a second in command he can hand independent authority to when he himself cannot be everywhere at once, when he's exploring an unfamiliar coastline, when he's off making a sacrifice, when he's simply asleep. Because even the smartest man alive still has to close his eyes eventually. That role, again and again across this voyage, falls to one man, Eurylochus. Below them, the crew, and here is where this story departs from what you might expect from a modern chain of command, and it's crucial to understand, because it explains everything that follows. These are not conscripted soldiers bound by military law to obey orders on pain of court-martial. They are companions. The actual word used for them, again and again, is a term that implies shared table, shared risk, shared voyage, something closer to comrades than subjects. They followed Odysseus to Troy and back, not because a legal system compelled them to, but because loyalty in this world is a live, ongoing relationship, renewed or withdrawn by the day, based on whether the man leading them still seems worth following. Loyalty, in other words, is not guaranteed. It is earned, continuously, and it can run out. And by the time this fleet reaches Thrinacia, it has been running out for a very long time. Here is the accumulated weight these men are carrying by this point in the voyage, and it is worth listing plainly, because no crew makes a decision like the one coming without this exact, accumulated damage behind them. They watched 6 of their own crewmates snatched from the deck of their own ship and eaten alive one by the monster Scylla, close enough to see it happen and unable to do a single thing to stop it. They survived the Cyclops Polyphemus, watching him crush two of their friends against a cave wall and eat them raw, bones and all, while the rest of the crew sat trapped in the dark, waiting to see whose turn was next. They lost their entire remaining fleet, every ship but one, to the Lestrygonians, a tribe of cannibal giants who smashed their vessels with boulders thrown from cliffs and speared the swimming survivors like fish. An entire flotilla of comrades wiped out in minutes, while Odysseus's single remaining ship escaped by nothing but luck of position. They spent a full year on Circe's island after she turned half of them into pigs. An entire year. Restored to human form eventually, yes, but a year that cost them time, cost them momentum, cost them whatever remained of the sense that this journey had a foreseeable end. And then, most recently, most rawly, they lost their entire ship's storage of wind. A literal bag of contrary winds gifted to Odysseus by the god Aeolus, specifically to guide them safely home. A gift that would have ended this entire ordeal in days. Because the crew, while Odysseus slept within sight of Ithaca, within sight of home, opened the bag themselves, convinced it held stolen treasure their captain was hoarding from them. The winds burst free. The storm blew them backward, away from home, all the way back to Aeolus's island, who this time refused to help at all, telling them plainly that a man the gods hate this much is not a man he wants to be associated with. That failure sits in this story like a scar. It is proof to every man on this ship of two things at once. First, that their captain keeps things from them, secrets, in their minds, worth stealing. And second, that disobeying him, even catastrophically, does not necessarily end in immediate death. It ends in setback, in suffering, but not always in the God-sent annihilation everyone keeps promising. That is a dangerous lesson for a starving crew to have already learned before Thrinacia even begins. So by the time these men beach their last remaining ship on the sun god's island, here is what they are. Exhausted past any reasonable definition of endurance, traumatized by repeated close-range loss of their friends to violence so grotesque most of them will never speak of it again. Distrustful of a captain who has, from their point of view, already gotten most of the fleet killed and kept secrets from the survivors. And now, on top of all of it, starving. Actually, clinically starving, with no ship's stores left, no game on an island sacred to a god who forbids them from touching the one abundant food source in front of them. This is the structural trap the entire episode has been building toward. A group of desperate, traumatized men, bound to their commander by nothing more durable than fading loyalty, forbidden by a warning from a god they've never personally seen do anything, from eating the only food available to them, on an island where the wind that would let them leave refuses, for a full month, to blow in any useful direction. There is no enforcement mechanism here, beyond persuasion and fear. No military police, no court-martial. Odysseus cannot chain these men to the deck. He cannot post a guard on every animal on an island this size, while also sleeping, hunting, praying, and navigating. His entire authority rests on the men continuing to believe that following him is still, on balance, their best chance of getting home alive. And into that exact vacuum, a moment when Odysseus walks inland to pray, alone, out of sight of the crew, for the very first time in this entire crisis, steps the one man on this ship with both the standing and the rhetoric to offer them an alternative. This is the system that produces catastrophe. Not a villain, not a monster on the beach, a structure. Stress this long, authority this fragile, hunger this severe, oversight this absent, in which one persuasive voice in one unguarded hour is enough to unmake everything that has kept 20 men alive for 10 years. Remember that word, structure. We're going to need it again before this episode is over. Now it's time to meet the man who filled that vacuum, not as a villain arriving to wreck the story, but as someone who had already been right once before and paid for it in humiliation instead of credit. Start with what almost nobody remembers about Eurylochus. The first time we see him do anything at all in this story, he is the one who survives. Not through luck, through instinct, through the single trait that will define and eventually destroy everyone around him. A refusal to walk blindly into a room he does not trust. We're on the island of Aiaia now, some years earlier in the voyage, well before Thrinacia, well before the starvation, well before any of this crew has reason to hate their captain. The ship has just survived the Lastrygonian massacre, the cannibal giants, the lost fleet, all of it, and landed, shaken and grieving, on the shore of a forested island with a single column of smoke rising from somewhere inland. Someone has to go find out what's there. Odysseus divides the surviving crew into two groups and draws lots to decide who leads the scouting party inland, into unknown territory, toward a source of smoke that could belong to anyone or anything. And the lot falls to Eurylochus. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about his standing before any of the rest of this story happens. He is not chosen at random from the general crew. He is one of two men trusted with independent command of a fleet this small, trusted enough that when the dice decide who takes the dangerous assignment and who stays behind with the ship, it's understood that either name could plausibly have come up, because either name is a man capable of leading. He takes 22 men with him, 22 men who trust his judgment enough to follow him into a forest none of them have ever seen, toward a house they can't yet make out, with wolves and mountain lions inexplicably prowling the tree line around it, animals that, strangely, don't attack. They approach anyway, weapons ready, expecting a fight that oddly never comes. Here's the detail that should have told Eurylochus everything he needed to know before a single man in his party took another step. Those wolves and lions aren't wild animals at all. They are men. Or they were, once. Earlier visitors to this same island, drugged by this same witch, transformed by this same wand, left to prowl the grounds around her house in animal bodies, with whatever remained of their human minds still trapped somewhere inside. That's why they don't attack. That's why they crowd around the newly arrived sailors instead, pressing close, almost affectionate, the way a house pet fawns over a returning owner. Because in some sense that is exactly what they're doing. Homer doesn't spell this out loudly enough for every man in that landing party to register it in the moment, and most of them don't. Eurylochus, alone among them, seems to feel the wrongness of it anyway, even without being able to name precisely why a mountain lion nuzzling his companion's legs like a hound should terrify him more than a mountain lion trying to kill them would. Inside that house is a woman singing at a loom, in a voice beautiful enough to draw the entire party toward her door without a second thought. Her name is Circe. She is not a mortal woman. She is a sorceress, a minor goddess in her own right, and she welcomes the men in with wine, with warm food, with every appearance of hospitality. All of them go inside, except one. Eurylochus stays outside. He does not go in with his men. He waits by the door, watching. And something about the scene, the too perfect welcome, the wolves that don't attack, the wine offered a little too readily to men who haven't eaten a proper meal in days, sets off an alarm in him that none of his 22 companions feel. Call it caution. Call it paranoia, if you're inclined to judge him harshly for what happens next. Either way, he does not cross that threshold. And inside, Circe's wine is drugged. The moment the men have eaten and drunk their fill, she touches each of them with her wand, and one by one, 22 grown men shrink and hunch and sprout bristled hide until the room that had been full of laughing, welcomed guests is instead full of pigs. Pigs with human minds still trapped inside them, fully aware of what has happened to their own bodies, herded into a pen outside to be fed acorns like livestock. Eurylochus watches it happen from outside, or close enough to piece together what's occurred, and does the only thing left to do. He runs. He runs the entire distance back to the ship, no small feat on an island whose terrain nobody's crew has mapped, and when he arrives, he cannot speak. Grief and terror have closed his throat entirely. His eyes are streaming. It takes him long, agonizing minutes, with the rest of the crew crowding around, demanding to know what's happened to their friends before he can force out any coherent account at all. Gone. All of them. Gone. Vanished. And he doesn't know what happened, only that whatever's in that house took every single man who walked through its door. This is a detail worth holding on to for the rest of this episode because it's going to matter enormously by the time we reach Thrinacia. Eurylochus's first instinct in this story, when faced with an unfamiliar and possibly divine threat, is not recklessness. It is withdrawal. It is exactly the caution that, if the story rewarded caution the way you might expect, should have made him the hero of this entire scene. It does not. When Odysseus hears what's happened, his response is immediate. He arms himself and sets out alone to rescue his men, ignoring every practical objection, moving on pure resolve. And he turns to Eurylochus first and asks him to come along. "Guide me back. Show me the way." Eurylochus refuses. He clings to Odysseus's knees, the posture of a suppliant, of a man begging, not the posture of an officer, and pleads with him not to go either. He has just watched 22 friends disappear inside that house. He believes with total sincerity that walking back in there is a death sentence, and he says so, plainly, weeping. "Leave the rest of us," he says. "Leave them, and let's get back to the ship while we still have one. The dead are dead. Save who's left." And Odysseus's response, recorded plainly without much softening, is to call him a coward, to draw his sword, actually draw it, against his own second-in-command, threatening to cut his head off right there on the beach for refusing a direct order, before the rest of the crew intervenes and physically holds him back, begging him not to kill one of his own men over this, arguing that maybe it's wiser to simply leave Eurylochus behind with the ship while Odysseus goes alone. Odysseus relents. He goes alone, encounters the god Hermes on the path, receives a magical herb that protects him from Circe's drugs, and, through a combination of divine help and his own famous cunning, not only survives Circe's house, but turns the tables on her entirely, forcing her to reverse the spell and restore his men. It works out. That's the important, cruel detail. Odysseus's recklessness is vindicated by the story completely, and Eurylochus's caution is not. The men are restored. The crew ends up spending a full, comfortable year on Circe's island, feasting, recovering, before finally continuing home. By every measure the narrative gives us, Odysseus was right to go, and Eurylochus was wrong to refuse. Contrast this dynamic for a moment with the other great second-in-command relationship this same heroic tradition produced, because the difference tells you something important about what makes Eurylochus's position so uniquely unstable. In the Iliad, the epic that precedes this one, Achilles has his own inseparable second, Patroclus, his closest companion, who dies not by opposing Achilles but by trying to embody him, putting on Achilles' own armor and leading his troops into battle in his commander's place. A death that becomes the single event that finally drags the sulking, furious Achilles back into the war. Patroclus' loyalty is rewarded, structurally, with the entire second half of that epic organized around avenging him. Eurylochus gets no equivalent narrative gift. His loyalty, when he shows it, pleading with Odysseus not to walk back into Circe's house alone, weeping on his knees, nearly gets him beheaded on the spot. His disobedience, when it finally comes, gets him drowned along with everyone he led. There is no version of this story where Eurylochus's death organizes anything, avenges anything, or moves anyone to fury on his behalf. He simply stops appearing, the way water stops being disturbed once whatever fell into it has finally settled at the bottom. Except that Eurylochus had no way of knowing, standing on that beach, that a god was about to intervene on Odysseus's behalf with a magic herb custom designed to counter exactly the threat they were facing. From where Eurylochus stood, with the information he actually had, 22 friends vanished into a house belonging to an unknown power on an unfamiliar island, walking back in was suicide. He wasn't wrong about the danger. He was only wrong about the outcome. And the outcome depended entirely on a divine intervention he had absolutely no reason to expect. This is the psychological seed the entire rest of this episode grows from, and it's worth being precise about it. Because the temptation is to flatten Eurylochus into a simple coward and be done with him. He isn't simple. He is a man who reads a threat correctly, argues for the safer course based on the evidence in front of him, is overruled and humiliated for it, called a coward to his face, nearly executed for it on the spot, and then watches his captain get spectacularly lucky and receive all the credit for a decision that could just as easily have gotten him killed too. What does a man learn from that? He learns, whether he'd ever say it out loud or not, that caution earns you contempt, that recklessness gets rewarded when it works, and that the difference between the two often comes down to nothing you can control, a god showing up on the road, or not. Let's talk about who this man was before any of this, because the story gives us fragments, and the fragments matter. Later tradition, sources beyond Homer's own text, filling in details the epic itself doesn't spell out, describes Eurylochus as connected to Odysseus's own household by marriage. Some accounts suggesting he was married to Odysseus's sister, which would make him not simply an officer under Odysseus's command, but literal family, bound to him by blood as well as oath. Whether or not every detail of that later tradition is reliable, the position Eurylochus occupies throughout Homer's own account supports the general picture. This is not some anonymous sailor plucked from the ranks. This is a man close to power, trusted with independent command, someone whose voice carries weight with the crew precisely because he has stood near the top of this chain of command since the beginning. If that later tradition is accurate, Eurylochus married to Odysseus's sister Ctimene, a match Odysseus himself is said to have helped arrange with a generous dowry before ever leaving for Troy, then everything that happens on that beach at Thrinacia carries a weight beyond simple military insubordination. This isn't an officer defying a commander he serves under by circumstance. This is a brother-in-law, a man bound into Odysseus's own household, someone who has sat at his family's table, who will, if either of them ever makes it home, have to look Odysseus's wife and sister in the eye and account for what happened to the ship that was supposed to bring their husband and brother home. The betrayal, if that's even the right word for it, isn't abstract. It's domestic. It's personal, in a way that makes his later defiance considerably harder to write off as simple mutiny, and considerably harder for Eurylochus himself, presumably, to have entered into lightly. That closeness to Odysseus is exactly what makes his later defiance so combustible. This isn't a stranger stirring up mutiny. This is the second most powerful man on the ship, someone the crew has watched lead them before, someone whose judgment has already been publicly, painfully tested once. Tested and, in the eyes of many of the men who watched Odysseus draw a sword on him, arguably vindicated by how close that whole scene came to disaster. Think about the dynamic building between these two men across the whole voyage, because it never really resolves. It just keeps recurring in different forms. Odysseus commits to a bold, often reckless plan justified by cunning and gods that only he seems able to appeal to successfully. Eurylochus voices the crew's fear, argues for caution, gets overruled. The bold plan works, mostly, because Odysseus keeps having exactly the kind of luck, divine favor, specifically Athena's favor, that Eurylochus does not share and cannot rely on. Every single time, the pattern repeats. Odysseus leads them somewhere dangerous. Eurylochus, or the crew through him, voices doubt. Odysseus overrides that doubt through sheer force of will, sometimes through actual force, up to and including drawn steel, And the outcome, again and again, depends entirely on whether Odysseus's personal favor with the gods holds, a favor Eurylochus has no access to, and every reason to suspect is running thin. Because it is running thin. That's the detail the crew can feel even if they can't name it precisely. 10 years into a war and a voyage that keeps costing them ship after ship, man after man, in increasingly horrific ways. Eaten alive by monsters, crushed by giants, drowned in storms. The evidence in front of Eurylochus isn't that Odysseus's cunning always saves them. The evidence is a graveyard of comrades stretching the entire length of the Mediterranean, punctuated by a handful of miraculous escapes that happened to include Odysseus and rarely included anyone else. So who is Eurylochus underneath all of this? Not a coward. Not exactly. A coward doesn't stand his ground weeping and pleading in front of a drawn sword, doesn't keep his post as second in command across a decade of a voyage that's killed nearly everyone else. He is something harder to categorize and much more dangerous to the story around him. He is a realist, trapped inside a narrative that keeps rewarding unrealistic risk. He is the man doing the actuarial math on every decision, weighing the odds, voicing the downside, trying to keep as many of his companions alive as he can, in a story where the actual math keeps getting overruled by divine intervention nobody but the captain seems to receive. And here's the darker layer underneath that, the one worth sitting with before we get to Thrinacia. What happens to a man's judgment when he's punished, publicly, for being right about the danger, and then watches the reckless choice succeed anyway, because a god intervened? He doesn't necessarily conclude he was wrong. He concludes something worse. He concludes that the entire system he's operating in, the chain of command, the divine warnings, the whole moral architecture of obedience, runs on luck he doesn't personally control. And that being right about the danger doesn't save you. Only luck saves you. And luck, on this voyage, has been running out, ship by ship, man by man, for 10 straight years. That is the man who's about to stand on a beach and reframe an oath sworn to the gods as a negotiable risk instead of an absolute law. Move forward now, through the year on Circe's island, through the terrifying detour past the sirens with their song of certain death, past Scylla and Charybdis, the twin horrors of the strait, one a 6-headed monster that snatches men straight off the deck, the other a whirlpool that swallows entire ships, a passage where Odysseus, following Circe's advice, deliberately sacrifices 6 men to Scylla rather than risk the whole ship to Charybdis. 6 men, chosen essentially at random, screaming Odysseus's name as the monster lifts them into the air and devours them while their crewmates watch from the deck, unable to help, forbidden even from fighting back because Circe warned that any attempt to strike at Scylla would only cost more lives. Picture what that does to the survivors. Not an abstract loss counted later in a casualty report. A visible, close-range personal horror. 6 specific men, friends, comrades of a decade, eaten alive in view of everyone, left, their names known, their faces known, gone in under a minute, while the rest of the crew rowed on because rowing on was the only option that didn't get more of them killed. Eurylochus is at the oar bench during this passage, same as every other able-bodied man aboard. There is no exemption from rowing for rank on a ship this short-handed, which means he doesn't get the mercy of looking away. He hears it, close enough to hear it, the specific individual voices of 6 men he has served beside for a decade, calling out names. Odysseus's name, according to the tradition, the captain's name, as if the captain might still somehow reach up into the air and pull them back down. He does not stop rowing. Nobody stops rowing. That is, in its own quiet way, the exact rehearsal for what happens on the beach at Thrinacia weeks later. A moment where continuing to function, continuing to follow the only order that keeps the rest of the crew alive, requires actively not helping men who are right in front of you beyond any help you could give them. Men carry that kind of arithmetic with them. It doesn't disappear once the immediate danger passes. It just waits for the next moment that calls for the same calculation. By the time this diminished, traumatized remainder of a crew reaches Thrinacia, they are not the same fighting force that left Troy. They are survivors of an accumulating catastrophe, and Eurylochus, the man who has voiced their fear at every previous turn, the man who has already been proven right about danger once before and humiliated for it, is still standing among them, still watching, still doing the math. And now the math changes completely, because now the enemy isn't a monster to fight past, it's their own bodies, failing by the day, with a herd of untouchable golden cattle standing in full view the entire time. 10 years is a long time to keep believing in anyone. 10 years is long enough for children to grow from infants into strangers you wouldn't recognize on a dock. Long enough for a marriage to either deepen in absence or simply become a memory somebody else is living without you. Long enough for the specific, concrete reasons you first agreed to follow a man onto a ship to have quietly eroded into something closer to habit or obligation, or simple lack of any better option. Whatever loyalty Eurylochus felt toward Odysseus at the start of this voyage, as kinsman, as subordinate, as a man who genuinely believed his captain's cunning would get them all home, has spent a decade being tested against a mounting body count that keeps landing on everyone except the man asking for the loyalty in the first place. That doesn't make loyalty disappear all at once, in a single dramatic break. It erodes the way coastline erodes, a little further gone every season, until one day there's simply less of it left than anyone standing on it realized. This is the setup for the breaking point. Not a sudden madness, a slow, accumulating, entirely legible collapse of trust, of hope, of the belief that obedience to a captain and a distant god is actually going to save anyone this time. Let's walk through exactly how that final month unfolds, because the story is careful to show you the erosion happening in stages, not all at once. When the ship first arrives at Thrinacia, Odysseus already knows, better than anyone, how dangerous this island is. Both Tiresias and Circe warned him about it, specifically, by name, before he ever set foot on it. This is the one stretch of the entire journey where the danger isn't a surprise sprung on him by an unfamiliar coastline. He knows exactly what waits here, and exactly what not to do. So he tries to sail past it entirely. He tells the crew everything, the warning, the stakes, the instruction to avoid the island altogether if they possibly can. And it's Eurylochus, again, who speaks up. Not this time with excessive caution, but with something closer to simple human exhaustion. The men are worn out, he says. It's near nightfall. Sailing on through darkness risks the ship on unfamiliar waters, storms that come up without warning. Exactly the kind of disaster that's already claimed most of their fleet. Let us land, he argues. Rest one night. Eat what food we have left. Leave again at first light. It's a reasonable argument. It's also, in hindsight, the first domino, because one night is never going to be one night on this voyage, and everyone in the ancient audience listening to this story already knew it. The same dread building the way it does when a character in a modern thriller says, just one more day, we'll be fine. Odysseus, worn down himself, gives in, but he extracts an oath first, has every man on the crew swear, formally invoking the gods as witness, not to touch a single one of the cattle or sheep they'll find grazing on this island. If they find any food at all, they eat only what's already in the ship's stores. They land. They eat what's left of their provisions, weeping, the story tells us, for the 6 friends lost to Scylla, grief and hunger arriving together in the same meal. And then the wind turns against them. Not a storm, something worse in its way. A contrary wind that simply will not let up, day after day, trapping the entire crew on an island covered in food they've sworn not to touch, watching their supplies dwindle to nothing while fat, sacred cattle graze in plain sight, close enough to smell. A month of this. 30 days of hunger creeping from discomfort into the specific, disorienting agony of real starvation. The kind that changes how a person thinks, narrows their whole world down to the single fact of the empty stomach, erodes judgment and patience and fear in ways that are now well understood clinically, but that these men were experiencing blind, with no framework for it except the raw animal terror of a body beginning, in a real sense, to consume itself. They exhaust the ship's food entirely. They turn to fishing with bent hooks, to snaring birds, whatever meager, desperate protein the coastline will give up. And it isn't nearly enough. Not for this many men. Not for this long. This is the exact moment Odysseus chooses to walk inland, alone, to find a sheltered spot and pray to the gods for some way out of this trap. He washes his hands in a place shielded from the wind, ritual purity before prayer, a detail the story includes specifically to make clear that Odysseus is doing everything correctly, everything by the book, right up until the moment it stops mattering, and asks the gods to show him a path forward. The gods, in response, send him to sleep instead. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment because it's almost too on the nose to be an accident in a story this carefully constructed. At the single most dangerous moment of the entire crisis, the exact hour when his presence and his authority are needed most, the leader of this expedition is put to sleep by forces beyond his control. He isn't negligent, he isn't distracted. He is removed from the equation entirely by exactly the kind of intervention that has shaped this entire voyage from the beginning. The gods acting on their own agenda, indifferent to what it costs the humans caught underneath it. And in that vacuum, Odysseus asleep, unreachable, unable to intervene, Eurylochus speaks. Everything we've traced up to this point in this man's story collapses into this single moment. The caution that was mocked at Circe's island, the realism that never once got him credit even when it was justified, the decade of watching reckless gambles pay off through luck he doesn't have access to, while the actual cost of every failure lands on the ordinary men around him rather than on the captain making the calls. The trauma of 6 friends screaming as Scylla lifted them into the air. The month of hunger, grinding every rational faculty these men have down to a single screaming animal priority: eat or die. Eurylochus gathers the men and delivers the argument that becomes, in every sense, this entire episode's hinge. Every death, he tells them, is hateful to wretched mortals, every single kind. But death by hunger, starving slowly, watching your own body waste away while food stands untouched in front of you the entire time. That is the most pitiful death there is. Consider the rhetorical construction of that argument for a moment, because it is genuinely sophisticated, not the ranting of a man who's lost his mind. He isn't denying that death is coming either way, or that divine punishment is a real possibility. He's reframing the entire choice. He's taking what Odysseus and the prophets have framed as a binary between obedience and disaster and replacing it with a different binary entirely. A fast death versus a slow one. And once you accept his framing, once you agree that this is fundamentally a choice about which kind of dying is more bearable, the conclusion he's steering toward becomes almost inevitable. He tells them, let's drive off the best of these cattle right now and sacrifice them properly to the immortal gods who hold the wide heaven, the full ritual done right out of respect rather than theft. And if we make it home to Ithaca after this, he promises, we will build Helios a rich temple there, filled with fine offerings to make amends for what we're about to do. And if the god is angry enough about his cattle to want to destroy our ship for it, well, he says, I would rather open my mouth to the waves and die at once than waste away slowly on this desert island. Notice what that speech accomplishes mechanically, because it's worth being precise about the psychological engineering at work here, even as we withhold judgment about the man delivering it. First, it validates the suffering everyone in that circle is already feeling. He doesn't dismiss their hunger. He elevates it, names it as the worst thing a person can experience, which is exactly what starving men desperately want to hear someone say out loud. Second, it offers a plan that looks like piety rather than theft, a full ritual sacrifice, the correct words, the correct fire, framed as honoring the god rather than robbing him, which gives every man in that circle a story he can tell himself about what he's doing that isn't simply mutiny and sacrilege. Third, it offers restitution deferred into a future that may never arrive. A temple, someday, richly furnished, once we're home, which lets every man defer the moral reckoning of what they're doing right now to a later date that conveniently absolves them of having to feel the full weight of it today. And fourth, and this is the part that seals it, it reframes the risk itself as something almost heroic. Better a quick death by drowning than a slow one by starving, which converts an act of disobedience into an act of controlled, even dignified choice. These men don't walk toward those cattle feeling like they're breaking a sacred oath. They walk toward them feeling like they are finally, after a month of helpless suffering, taking their fate back into their own hands. That is the machine of persuasion. And it worked on every single man standing in that circle. There's a fifth element worth naming, quieter than the other four, but doing just as much work underneath them. Timing. Eurylochus doesn't make this argument on day one of the hunger, when the men are uncomfortable but still functional, still reasoning with something closer to their ordinary judgment. He doesn't make it on some hypothetical day 40 either, when starvation might have progressed past the point where an audience could still follow a structured argument at all. He makes it precisely when exhaustion has worn the crew down enough to want an answer badly, but before it's worn them down so far that reasoned persuasion no longer works on them. And precisely in the one window when the person most likely to countermand him is out of earshot. Whether that's calculation or simple accumulated desperation reaching its own natural boiling point at exactly that hour is impossible to say for certain. But the timing itself did as much work as the words. Not one voice raised in protest is recorded. Not one man stood up and said, "Wait, we swore an oath, invoked the gods as witness, and this is exactly the island and exactly the cattle we were warned about, twice, by name." If any man thought it, the story doesn't preserve his voice. What the story preserves instead is unanimous, immediate compliance. 20 starving men who, moments earlier, would likely have described themselves as loyal to their captain and mindful of the gods, walking together toward a herd of sacred cattle with knives already in hand. This is the exact moment Eurylochus stops being second in command and becomes something else entirely. The architect, however reluctant, however sympathetically motivated, of his own crew's destruction. And it's worth asking the question the episode's outline poses directly, because there's no clean answer waiting at the bottom of it. Was Eurylochus a coward, taking the easy way out the moment his captain's back was turned? A realist, seeing through an obedience that had already cost this crew nearly everything, with nothing to show for it but a graveyard behind them? Or something harder to name? A man who had simply run out of faith in leadership and replaced it, understandably, humanly, with the only logic left available to a starving man. Survive today and figure out the cost tomorrow? Homer doesn't tell you which one to believe. He gives you the speech, gives you the unanimous, silent compliance of 20 other men who could have objected and didn't, and leaves the verdict standing open. Which, if you'd been paying attention to this whole story, might be the most honest thing about it. Because the people who actually have to make this decision in the moment, starving, exhausted, 10 years from home, rarely get the luxury of a clean verdict either. They get an argument that sounds reasonable, a captain who isn't there to stop them, and a herd of cattle standing close enough to smell. We know what happens next. We saw it in the opening minutes of this episode, the crawling hides, the moaning meat, the 6 days of feasting that followed anyway. Because once the line is crossed, going back to starving voluntarily is somehow harder than continuing to eat. What we haven't covered yet is how the system around this one decision actually turned it into a catastrophe. Because a bad choice made by 20 desperate men on a beach is one thing. What happens next, the machine of consequence that converts that single afternoon into the annihilation of an entire crew, is a different story entirely. And it's the one we're telling next. Every atrocity needs two things to actually happen: a decision and a mechanism that carries that decision through to its conclusion without anyone able to stop it part way. We've spent the last segment inside the decision.
Now we need to look at the machine. The specific chain of cause and effect that turns one afternoon of slaughter on a beach into the drowning deaths of 19 men weeks later, in open water under a clear sky, exactly as promised. Start with the mechanism of disobedience itself, because it's more precise, more structural than some men got hungry and broke a rule. It runs through 3 distinct stages, each one enabling the next. Stage 1. Leadership vacuum. This is the precondition, and we've already established how it opened. Odysseus, preying inland, then put to sleep by forces outside his control, entirely removed from the decision-making process at the exact hour it mattered most. Without this vacuum, none of what follows is possible. Eurylochus does not stage a coup. He does not challenge Odysseus directly, does not confront him, does not even wait for him to return before making his case. He waits, specifically, for the one window in this entire month-long ordeal when the chain of command has a hole in it, and fills that hole immediately. Stage 2. Rhetoric substituting for authority. Eurylochus has no formal power to override an oath the entire crew swore to the gods themselves. What he has instead is persuasion, the specific speech we walked through in the last segment, engineered, whether consciously or not, to convert shared suffering into shared consent. This matters because it changes the nature of what's about to happen. This isn't Eurylochus ordering the men to kill the cattle and the men complying out of obedience to a superior. It's Eurylochus making an argument, and the men agreeing with it. The distinction sounds small. It is not. An order followed under duress carries the responsibility mostly upward, to whoever gave it. An argument accepted willingly distributes the responsibility across every single person who accepted it. Stage 3. The decision becomes collective rather than individual, and this is the stage that makes the whole machine irreversible. Once the entire crew has heard the argument and moved toward the cattle, there is no longer a single man whose choice could have been different without consequence to himself. To object now, after the group has already begun moving, is not simply to disagree, it's to isolate yourself from the only source of food and safety available on an island where you can't survive alone. The social machinery of the group has closed around the decision. Whatever any individual man privately believed about the oath they'd sworn, the practical reality is that dissent now costs something dissent didn't cost 20 minutes earlier, back when it was still just an argument being made around a fire. This is how group catastrophe generally works, in myth and in recorded history alike. And it's worth naming the pattern plainly, because it recurs far outside this one Greek island. Desperation lowers the threshold for taboo violation. A persuasive voice fills a vacuum left by absent authority, and the decision, once collectivized, becomes self-reinforcing. Every additional person who joins makes it marginally harder for the next person to refuse. Now, the act itself, and it's worth returning to the specific details, because the story is deliberately, almost forensically precise about them. And precision is the point. The men don't simply run at the herd and start hacking. They select the finest cattle specifically, an act that in any other context would read as an honor, the kind of careful selection you'd make for a sacrifice you actually believed was sanctioned. They attempt a proper ritual. They prayed to the gods before the killing, exactly as any legitimate sacrifice would require. They lack barley, the white grain traditionally scattered in these rites, and substitute oak leaves instead, doing their best with what an island with no cultivated land can actually provide. This detail is doing real work, and it's worth sitting with directly. The men aren't committing a crime that looks like a crime. They're committing sacrilege dressed in the exact costume of piety. Every outward form of a legitimate religious sacrifice is present: the selection, the prayer, the ritual killing, even an attempt at the traditional grain, however imperfect. What's missing isn't the form. What's missing is the god's consent. And no amount of correct ritual can substitute for that. This is the mechanism insight worth carrying forward from this entire episode, because it recurs constantly in stories about how ordinary people cross catastrophic lines. Moral compromise rarely announces itself as moral compromise. It shows up wearing the clothes of legitimacy. The men aren't stealing meat in some crude, obviously criminal sense. They are performing a sacrifice, complete with promised future restitution. The temple to Helios they swear to build once they're home, which lets every man in that circle tell himself a coherent story in which he is not a thief and not an oath breaker, but a desperate man doing something regrettable but forgivable, with the debt already scheduled for repayment. Promise the payment later, and the violation now becomes bearable. That's the whole mechanism, in a single sentence. And it is not unique to this island or this myth. Then, the sign. The detail from our cold open, worth revisiting now with the full context behind it. The hides crawling on the ground as though the flesh underneath still lived. The meat, both raw and roasting, beginning to low, an animal sound rising out of dead flesh with no throat left to make it. This isn't decoration. In the logic of this story, it is confirmation, delivered immediately, that the god is already seen and the punishment has already been set in motion, and the men eat anyway. For 6 days, either because they have convinced themselves the omen means something other than what it obviously means, or because by that point the machine has already carried them past the point where stopping and starving instead feels like a real option anymore. There's a specific, well-documented cruelty buried inside those 6 days that the ancient text doesn't dwell on, but that's worth naming plainly, because it adds a layer of horror the myth doesn't need magic to produce. A body that has been starving for a month does not simply return to normal the instant food becomes available again. The sudden reintroduction of rich food to a severely depleted system is its own kind of danger. Disorientation, physical distress, a body that has spent weeks learning to run on almost nothing suddenly flooded with more than it can process. Whatever else was happening on that beach, the omens, the guilt, the 6-day countdown toward a punishment none of them could see coming, these men were also quite literally making themselves sick on the first real meal they'd had in a month, gorging past any reasonable limit, because reasonable limits are exactly what a month of starvation strips away first. Then the chain of consequences, and this is where the machine shifts from human decision-making entirely into divine mechanism, the part of the story where the gods stop being background pressure and become the executing agent. Understand what kind of god has just been robbed, because it isn't incidental to how swiftly and totally this particular punishment lands. Helios isn't a minor local deity with a small provincial claim to defend. He is the sun itself, driving his chariot across the sky every single day without fail, seeing, by definition, by the very nature of what he is, everything that happens anywhere beneath him. He is, in other Greek stories, the god who reports Aphrodite's affair with Ares to her husband Hephaestus, purely because he happened to see it happen, and telling what he sees is simply what he does. There is no darkness he doesn't reach, no hidden cove or beached ship where an act goes unwitnessed if it happens during daylight. These cattle aren't ordinary livestock he happens to own. Ancient tradition places their number at exactly 350 of each, cattle and sheep, a number that mirrors the days of a year, tended eternally by his own daughters, never bred, never slaughtered, existing purely as a kind of standing monument to his own perpetual, unblinking vigilance. Killing them isn't simply theft. It's an act of sacrilege committed in full view of the one witness in the entire cosmos who is structurally incapable of not seeing it. Helios discovers the slaughter, in some tellings told directly by one of his own herdsmen, a nymph named Lampetia, who watches over the cattle specifically so this exact violation can be reported. And his response is not to punish the men himself, directly on the spot. It's to appeal upward, to Zeus, in a formal complaint, demanding justice or else, and the threat attached to that demand is worth quoting in substance because it tells you something important about how this cosmos is actually structured. If I am not paid fitting requital for these cattle, Helios says, I will go down to the underworld and shine among the dead instead, and the world above will lose its light entirely. This is not an idle threat in this cosmology. The sun withdrawing itself from the sky is not a metaphor for sulking. It's an actual catastrophic possibility that the entire functioning of the visible world depends on avoiding. Zeus is not simply being asked to punish some sailors as a favor. He's being asked to prevent the collapse of daylight itself. So Zeus agrees. And here is the detail worth underlining before we move to the execution itself. This isn't Zeus deciding independently that these men deserve death.
It's the enforcement of a promise, a structural obligation Zeus holds as guarantor of oaths and divine order, triggered automatically by the violation. The same way a contract triggers a penalty clause the instant its terms are broken. The punishment isn't personal, it's mechanical. It was always going to happen, from the moment the first cow's throat was cut. Regardless of how sincere the men's prayers were, regardless of the temple they promised to build. The machine doesn't care about intent, it cares about the broken term. Here's a detail worth knowing, because it reframes everything that's happened in this episode so far. This exact story, this specific act of the crew eating Helios's cattle against every warning, is the very first thing Zeus says in the entire Odyssey. Before Odysseus is even introduced by name, before a single wave of this voyage has been described, the poem opens on Mount Olympus with Zeus complaining out loud to the assembled gods about how mortals are always so quick to blame divine forces for miseries that, in his words, they bring on themselves through their own recklessness beyond what fate alone assigned them. And the specific example he reaches for immediately, unprompted, is this crew eating these cattle in defiance of an explicit warning. In other words, this entire epic, before it tells you a single other thing about Odysseus's decade-long ordeal, wants you to understand this exact moment as the paradigm case of human beings causing their own destruction and then, presumably, being remembered as victims of fate rather than authors of their own downfall. Zeus isn't offering that example as an aside. He's opening an entire epic with it. Which tells you something about how seriously this culture wanted its audience to sit with the idea that Eurylochus's speech on that beach was not an unlucky roll of cosmic dice. It was, as far as the god enforcing the punishment was concerned, a textbook case. The execution itself, when it comes, is swift and almost clinically precise in its selectivity, which is itself a detail worth pausing on. 7 days after the slaughter, the wind finally turns, and the crew, the entire crew, every man who ate that meat and every man who didn't, sets sail at last, relieved beyond words to finally be leaving the island that trapped them for a month. They clear the coast, land disappears behind them, and Zeus sends a storm. Not an ordinary storm. Thunder cracks directly overhead, and lightning strikes the ship itself, splitting the mast, which crashes down and kills the helmsman instantly. The man steering the vessel, gone in a single blow, thrown from the deck. The ship spins, takes on water, and finally breaks apart entirely, throwing every remaining man into open water miles from any shore. Picture the sequence in real time because it happens fast, faster than anyone aboard has time to process. One moment there's a following wind, land already gone from view, men allowing themselves for the first time in 7 days something close to relief. The next, the sky goes the wrong color all at once, black, rolling in from a direction no one was watching, and the light,
Of all things, on this particular ship, after this particular crime, the light itself turns violent. A crack of thunder loud enough to feel in the chest. Then the strike, white fire down the mast, wood exploding rather than simply splitting, and the helmsman, the one man whose entire job is to keep this ship pointed toward home, is dead before he hits the deck, before anyone else has even registered what's happened.
What's left of the ship spins once, twice, takes the next wave broadside and comes apart. No slow sinking, no time to reach for anything, just open water all at once for every man still breathing. And here is the detail the story insists on, the one detail that separates this ending from a simple shipwreck. Every single man in that water drowns. Every one. 19 men who followed Eurylochus's argument to that beach, who ate that meat for 6 days, who set sail believing they'd escape consequence entirely because a full week had passed without incident. Every one of them dies in that water, dragged under by wreckage or exhaustion or simple bad luck, and a sea suddenly turned violently against them. Except one. Odysseus survives. The one man who never touched the meat, who fasted through 6 days of watching his own crew feast while he refused, unable to stop them but unwilling to share in what he knew was coming. He survives specifically because he clings to the wreckage of his own mast and keel lashed together and drifts, alone, for days, eventually washing up on another island entirely, having lost every single companion who sailed with him out of Troy. Every single one. This is worth sitting with in cold, precise terms because the story does not soften it, and neither should we. 10 years of war. A decade-long voyage home. Monsters survived, giants outrun, a witch's spell broken, 6 men lost to Scylla in one horrific afternoon, and after all of that, the entire remaining crew is wiped out in a single storm, in open water, as direct and specific punishment for one meal eaten out of desperation on the advice of a man who had, by every reasonable account available to him at the time, been trying to save his companions from starving to death. Now the ground-level executors of this catastrophe, because it's worth being precise about who actually did what, rather than collapsing the whole event into a single guilty name. The crew, starving, traumatized, persuaded, genuinely persuaded, not coerced at knife point, by an argument that offered them a story in which their survival and their piety weren't mutually exclusive. They are not blameless. They swore an oath and broke it, with full knowledge of what they were breaking. But they are also not simply villains. They are men who had already watched 6 of their friends eaten alive, who had already spent a month starving on a sacred island through no fault of their own, who were offered a plausible, ritually correct-looking path forward by a trusted officer, and who took it, unanimously, without recorded protest. Eurylochus, the catalyst, and it's important to use that word precisely, rather than reaching for something harsher, because a catalyst is not the same thing as a sole actor. He didn't force a single man toward those cattle. He made an argument. And the argument worked because it was aimed at men already primed by hunger and grief to accept it. Strip away his eloquence, and you still have 20 starving men on a beach with sacred cattle in front of them and no captain to stop it. The tinder was already there. What Eurylochus supplied was the spark and the specific shape the disaster took. Whether that makes him more or less responsible than the men who followed him is exactly the question this episode has been circling since the cold open, and it does not have a clean answer. Odysseus, absent at the precise moment it mattered, and this deserves its own honest accounting rather than being waved away as simple bad luck. He knew the danger of this island better than anyone aboard. He'd been warned twice, specifically, by name. He extracted the oath in the first place because he understood exactly how dangerous the temptation would be. And then he walked away from his own crew, alone, at the one moment an entire month of accumulated desperation was primed to boil over and was put to sleep by forces outside his control precisely then. Is that a failure of leadership?
Or is it simply what happens to even the most capable commander when the gods themselves choose to intervene against him? The story seems to want it both ways. It exonerates Odysseus almost entirely in how it frames his survival as reward for his own restraint, while quietly leaving the uncomfortable fact sitting there in plain view. The one time in this entire voyage that his presence was most critical, he wasn't present, and 19 men paid for that absence with their lives. Now, what makes a system like this self-sustaining? What turns a single bad decision into an unstoppable machine that nobody, once it starts, seems able to interrupt? And this is worth drawing out as its own distinct piece because it's the part of the story that generalizes furthest beyond this one Greek island. Group psychology does most of the early work. Desperation, sustained long enough, doesn't just make people more willing to break rules. It changes what feels like a rule worth keeping in the first place. An oath sworn to distant, unseen gods weighed against the immediate, physical, undeniable reality of a starving body simply doesn't carry the same weight it did a month earlier, when the men were fed and the danger was abstract. This isn't a psychological quirk unique to Bronze Age sailors. It's measurable, replicated, essentially universal. Extended deprivation reliably narrows a person's moral horizon down toward the immediate and the physical, at the expense of the distant and the abstract, in every documented instance from historical famine to modern survival ordeals. Homer didn't need a laboratory to know this. He just needed to watch what happens to a hungry crew. Authority collapse does the rest. The instant the formal chain of command has a gap in it, even a temporary one, even one caused by forces entirely outside anyone's control, an alternative authority doesn't just become possible, it becomes almost inevitable. Because a group under this much stress cannot simply sit in leaderless limbo. Someone will speak, someone will offer a plan, and whoever that person is inherits in that moment an authority that isn't formally theirs, running purely on the desperation of the people listening.
It happened once already on this exact voyage, remember, with the bag of winds? A different vacuum, a different moment of unsupervised crew judgment, but the same underlying mechanism. Odysseus asleep, an opportunity opening, and the men filling it themselves. Thrinacia isn't a new failure mode. It's the same one, recurring, this time with fatal instead of merely costly results. And rationalization seals the whole structure shut, retroactively, so that by the time anyone might have second thoughts, there's already a story in place that makes those second thoughts feel unnecessary. We will repay it later. We're doing this the right way with the right words. It's a fast death or a slow one, and at least this way we choose.
Every one of these justifications does the same job. They convert an act that, described plainly, is straightforward oath-breaking and theft from a god into something that feels, from the inside, like a defensible, even principled decision made by people who had run out of better options. By the time the wind finally turns and it's time to leave the island, the story the crew has told itself is so complete, so internally consistent, that 7 full days pass without incident, and every man aboard likely believes by then that the danger has passed entirely, that a god who was truly furious would not have waited a week to act. That's the machine. Not cruelty, not madness. A starving crew, an absent captain, and one persuasive argument that made an unbearable violation feel, for exactly long enough, like the only reasonable choice left on the table. And now we get to what's left after the machine has run its course. Because the story doesn't end with the drowning. It ends with the question of what all of this was for, and who gets remembered for it. And that's a very different kind of reckoning than the one the gods handed down on that beach. Here is the final tally, and it deserves to be stated as plainly and coldly as the story itself states it. Of every man who sailed out of Troy under Odysseus's command, an entire fleet, hundreds of men across 12 ships at the very start of this journey, exactly 1 survives to see home again. 1. Everyone else is dead. eaten by Cyclops, smashed by giants, drowned in storms, torn apart by Scylla, or, in this final catastrophe, struck down by lightning and drowned in open water as punishment for a single meal eaten out of 10 years of accumulated desperation. Eurylochus dies in that water, along with everyone else he led to that beach. And here is the detail worth sitting with, because it says something about how this entire story chooses to remember him. He gets no final words, no last speech, no moment of regret or defiance preserved for the audience the way his speech at Thrinacia was preserved in such careful, deliberate detail. He simply drowns, one name among 18 others, swallowed by the same sea that swallows all of them, and the story moves on without pausing over his specific death at all. Compare that to how carefully the story lingered on his speech. Word by word, argument by argument, we were given his exact reasoning, his exact appeal to the men, the precise rhetorical shape of the case that doomed them all. And then, when the consequence actually arrives, he is granted nothing. No closing statement, no final scene. He simply becomes one more body in the water, indistinguishable, in the end, from the men who followed him there. That asymmetry is not an accident. It's the story making a choice about whose voice matters and whose doesn't once the outcome is settled. And it's worth remembering because it's about to happen again on a much larger historical scale to Eurylochus's reputation across the next 3,000 years of people telling this story. Think about what the voyage actually becomes, structurally, from this point forward. Up until Thrinacia, this has been, however grim, a story of collective struggle. A captain and his crew, companions, facing horror after horror together, losing people along the way, but still, fundamentally, a group enduring something as a group. After Thrinacia, it stops being that story entirely. It becomes a solitary survival narrative. One man, alone on a raft, then alone on an island with the nymph Calypso for 7 more years, then alone again washing ashore on the coast of the Phaeacians with nothing but the clothes another survivor might have handed him. Everyone who could have corroborated any part of this account, every companion who might have offered a different version of events, a different account of who said what on that beach, a different read on whether Eurylochus's argument was reasonable or catastrophic, is dead. Odysseus alone gets to tell this story, to the Phaeacians and later to us, and there is no one left alive to disagree with a single word of it. That's worth calling what it actually is: narrative monopoly. The Odyssey, as a text, survives specifically because Odysseus survives to tell it, which means every account we have of Eurylochus, his reasoning, his motives, his final speech, comes to us filtered entirely through the perspective of the one man who had every reason in the story, and possibly every psychological reason as a survivor, to frame that speech as a fatal, foolish mistake, rather than an act of desperate, understandable leadership under conditions nobody else on that beach could have withstood any better. We will never hear Eurylochus's own account of what those 6 weeks of starvation actually felt like from the inside. We only have Odysseus's version, a version delivered, remember, to a royal court he's hoping will help him get home, where the moral of a story in which his own crew doomed themselves through disobedience serves his own reputation considerably better than any version in which his own extended absence at the critical hour might share in the blame. Think about that. Every version of this story you've ever heard exists because the one man least likely to blame himself is the only man left alive to tell it. Now, how has this specific moment actually been treated across the centuries of people reading, translating, and retelling this story? Because the reception history is its own kind of legacy, separate from the events themselves, and it's revealing in its own right. For most of the classical tradition, the verdict on Eurylochus was simple and largely unkind. He is remembered, where he's remembered at all, as the mutineer, the man whose weakness cost the crew everything. A cautionary figure standing in stark, deliberate contrast to Odysseus's own famous restraint and cunning.
Ancient audiences, listening to this story as a moral exemplar as much as an adventure tale, were generally meant to hear Eurylochus's speech and recognize it as a failure of will, a lesson in what happens when a man lets appetite and fear override oath and obedience. It's worth noting, too, what this scene never really became, compared to so much of the rest of the Odyssey. Circe turning men into pigs, the siren's song, the Cyclops blinded by a burning stake, Scylla and Charybdis, Penelope at her loom. These are the images that recur across Greek vase painting, Roman wall fresco, and centuries of later Western art, instantly recognizable, endlessly reproduced. The slaughter of the cattle of the sun rarely gets the same treatment. There's no single iconic image most people would recognize on sight the way they'd recognize the sirens luring a lashed Odysseus toward the rocks.
Maybe that's simply because it's a harder scene to render. There's no monster, no witch, no clear visual hook. Just 20 ordinary men killing ordinary-looking cattle on an empty beach. Or maybe it's something closer to what we've been circling this whole hour. This is the one act in the entire epic with no external villain to paint. Just human choice and its price. Modern readings, particularly over the last century or so of literary criticism, have complicated that verdict considerably. Not by excusing what happened, but by taking seriously a question the ancient tradition mostly wasn't interested in asking. What exactly was Eurylochus supposed to do? Some modern interpreters read him as the single most human character in the entire epic. More human certainly than Odysseus, whose survival depends so heavily on divine favor that his choices rarely carry the same weight of genuine risk. Eurylochus has no goddess intervening on his behalf. He has no magical herb waiting on the road to protect him from every danger. He has only the ordinary human tools available to an ordinary man under extraordinary strain. Reason, persuasion, and a body that is, in the most literal sense, starving to death in real time. Read this way, his speech at Thrinacia isn't the ranting of a weak man. It's closer to an early, unwitting statement of an existential position. Confronted with absurd, disproportionate suffering and a silent, indifferent set of divine rules that offer no relief, he chooses meaning and agency over passive obedience to a system that has already cost him nearly everyone he knows. Other readings push back on romanticizing him too far in the other direction, pointing out that his caution at Circe's island, so easily read as wisdom, was also, in its own way, a kind of paralysis, a refusal to act that would have left 22 men transformed into pigs indefinitely had Odysseus not overridden him. On this reading, Eurylochus isn't simply a realist punished for being right. He's a man whose instincts run consistently towards self-preservation over collective risk, in both directions, refusing to enter danger when it might have saved his friends, and later leading his friends into danger specifically because his own hunger, and theirs, had become unbearable. Not a coward exactly, and not a hero either. Something more unsettling. An ordinary man doing what ordinary men generally do under enough pressure, which is protect themselves and the people closest to them, using whatever justification the moment supplies. Whichever reading you find more persuasive, one thing holds steady across all of them. Eurylochus is permanently, structurally overshadowed. He exists in this story almost entirely in relation to Odysseus, as his second, his foil, his cautionary counterexample. And he is remembered, when he's remembered at all, almost exclusively in the context of his one catastrophic failure, with none of the earlier caution, the earlier loyalty, the decade of competent service that preceded it, carrying nearly the same narrative weight. Now, the deeper question underneath all of this, the one the outline for this episode poses directly, and that this entire hour has been circling without ever quite landing on, in myth, where does the blame for a catastrophe like this actually sit? The honest answer is that it sits in 3 places at once, and the story never fully resolves the tension between them. There is divine punishment, Zeus, Helios, the entire machinery of oath and consequence that makes this outcome feel, within the logic of this cosmos, inevitable and just. Break a sworn oath to the gods, and destruction follows.
That is simply how this universe is built, and no amount of human suffering or desperation changes the terms of that contract once it's been broken. There is fate, the broader sense, present throughout the entire Odyssey, that certain outcomes are simply fixed, that Odysseus was always going to arrive home alone, regardless of any single decision made along the way, that the specific mechanism of his crew's destruction matters less than the fact that their destruction was, in some sense, always coming. And there is human error, the actual, granular, human-scale account of exhausted, starving men making a specific decision on a specific afternoon that they did not have to make, however sympathetic the pressure behind it. It's worth noticing, too, that all three of these explanations survive into how later cultures have talked about their own catastrophes, long after anyone still believed a literal Helios was watching from a chariot in the sky. Every collapse, a mutiny, a massacre, a financial ruin, a war entered for reasons that don't survive contact with hindsight, tends to get explained afterward using some blend of exactly these same three registers: forces beyond anyone's control, an inevitability nobody could have stopped, and specific decisions specific people made and could, in theory, have made differently. Which explanation gets emphasized usually says less about what actually happened and more about who's doing the explaining and what they need the story to mean. Eurylochus's crew got the version told by the one man who survived, delivered to a court whose good opinion he needed. Most catastrophes get told, eventually, by whoever's left standing to tell them. Myth, characteristically, refuses to pick one of these three and call it the real explanation. It layers them on top of each other and leaves the audience to sit with all three at once, which is, if you think about it, a more honest account of how catastrophe actually happens than any single explanation could offer. Real disasters are rarely the product of one clean cause. They are the product of structural conditions nobody fully controls, moments of genuine human failure, and, if you're inclined to believe in something like fate or historical inevitability, forces larger than any individual choice. But strip away the gods for a moment. Set Zeus and Helios and the entire machinery of divine punishment aside, purely as a thought experiment, and look only at the human chain of cause and effect, and the story becomes uncomfortably clear about where the fatal decision actually originated. It wasn't the crew's hunger. Hunger doesn't kill a man on its own, inside 7 days of a favorable wind. It makes him desperate, but desperation alone doesn't butcher sacred cattle. It wasn't Odysseus's absence, exactly, either, though his absence created the space the decision needed. The fatal decision. The one specific pivot point where this entire disaster becomes locked in and irreversible is the moment one man, standing in front of 20 desperate companions, took an unbearable situation and handed it a story that made the unthinkable feel not just possible, but right. That is Eurylochus's actual legacy, stripped of both the ancient condemnation and the modern rehabilitation. Not villain, not hero, but the specific human hinge on which an entire crew's fate turned, in one unwatched hour, on one strip of sacred coastline, 3,000 years ago. Cultures return to stories like this one for a reason that has nothing to do with cattle or sun gods. They return to them because the actual mechanism on display, exhaustion lowering the threshold for catastrophe, a persuasive voice filling a vacuum, a group finding collective permission to do what no single member would do alone, is not a Bronze Age artifact. It is simply what groups of frightened, depleted people do, in any century, under enough sustained pressure, whether the sacred boundary in front of them is a herd of cattle on a beach or something else entirely. Homer just happened to write it down first, and write it down well enough that 3,000 years later, we're still using his crew as the reference case.
So here is the final question this story leaves standing open, and it's worth taking seriously, rather than resolving too quickly, because it's the same question that sits underneath every account of ordinary people crossing a line they knew on some level they were not supposed to cross.
When survival itself is genuinely at stake, not hypothetically, not abstractly, but in the specific, physical, day-by-day reality of a body beginning to fail, is obedience to a rule still a virtue? Or does morality, at some threshold of suffering, simply collapse into necessity, into whatever argument makes it possible to keep breathing one more day? Homer doesn't answer that question for you. He gives you a starving man, a persuasive argument, 20 companions who said nothing to stop it, and a sea that swallowed every one of them, regardless of what they'd told themselves on that beach. Go back one more time to that scream at the very start of this episode, the sound a cow is not supposed to make, coming out of a blade already buried to the hilt. That was never really about the animal. It was the sound of 20 men crossing a line they all, on some level, knew was there, and choosing to cross it together so that no single one of them would have to carry the weight of having crossed it alone. It worked for 6 days. The wind turned, the ship sailed, and then it stopped working, all at once, in open water, the way these things generally do, not gradually, not with warning, just a sky going the wrong color and the silence afterward where 19 voices used to be. Make of that what you will. Remember his name anyway, Eurylochus, the man who was right the first time and ruined by the second.